Hi, welcome back to the 6th episode of Just the Facts, Ma'am. Today is May 12th, 2025, and today is going to be part 1 of definition of terms. In the last couple of months, Americans have really leaned into our First Amendment rights, specifically those of freedom of speech and freedom of peaceful assembly, and that translates to a lot of signs, right? Yard signs, protest signs, parade banners, t-shirts, all containing various terms. And then those terms are discussed around the water cooler, in the news. And this is a great example of why I chose to start this channel, is not to influence how you think about those terms, but just that we're all using them correctly, right? So language matters. Let's not be lazy. All of these terms, there are 5 that I'm going to talk about today, they have commonly been used as a synonym for bad or things I don't like. But there's actually definitions to these, so let's learn about them together. Number 1 is fascism. Fascism is a political ideology of the extreme far right, authoritarian and ultranationalist. So it's characterized by a dictator-style leadership, central control of most, if not all, aspects of society, like the economy, education, the media, and a forcible oppression of dissent. Fascism is opposed to democracy and free markets, and it is known as an extreme example of us versus them politics, more than just Democratic Party versus Republican Party. A book by similar name was written in 2018, and I'm just going to quote from that. He says it better than I could. So, from How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us and Them by Jason Stanley, fascism is, quote, a cult of the leader who promises national restoration in the face of humiliation brought on by supposed communists, Marxists, minorities, immigrants, who are supposedly posing a threat to the character and the history of a nation. The leader proposes that only he can solve it, and all of his political opponents are enemies or traitors. So, who does that make you think of? Adolf Hitler, right? However, fascism, the term, is Italian and comes from Benito Mussolini, who was the leader of Italy in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. Fascia is Italian for groups or bundles, and the fascista was the political organization under Mussolini when he really brought this type of leadership to the world stage. Hitler then expanded upon that. In the document below, not only do I have the price trends of gas, milk, and eggs references for today's talk, but I also have correct and incorrect uses of these terms. And I think it's important to highlight an incorrect use of fascism would be Kamala Harris is a fascist. And I don't even care what you think about Kamala Harris. She's been a lot of things to a lot of people all along the good to bad spectrum, but what she's never been to anyone ever is fascist. Because by definition, fascism is ultra far right, which she is not. Okay, number 2, you can't really talk about fascism if you don't then talk about Antifa. And Antifa is just a shortening of anti-fascism. It was a term coined in Germany in 1940s, post-World War II, in response to Hitler's fascist regime. While fascism is far right, Antifa is far left. And supporters aim to oppose far-right extremists like neo-Nazis and white supremacists. They tend to be leaning towards an anarchy and anti-nationalist orientation. There have been Antifa groups all throughout Europe, throughout Asia, in Syria against the Islamic State, and in North America. All right, next is autocracy. Autocracy is a form of government in which the head of state controls absolute power. Democracy and autocracy represent fundamentally different systems of government. I'm just going to read this to you. Democracy emphasizes citizen participation, freedom, and the protection of individual rights, whereas autocracy concentrates power in the hands of a single person or a small group, often suppressing dissent and limiting freedoms. Some examples: Genghis Khan, King Henry VIII, Napoleon Bonaparte. Used in a sentence correctly, everybody thinks Star Wars. Quote, of course, being an autocrat, Emperor Palpatine will use this attempt on his life to justify actually slaughtering thousands of Jedi. Number 4, dictatorship. Now pay attention, because the definition is exactly the same as what I just stated for autocracy. So dictatorship is a form of government in which absolute power is held by the head of state. However, there are some differences. All dictators are autocrats, but not all autocrats are dictators. And there's 2 general ways to sort of suss out the difference between dictators and autocrats. Dictators tend to have seized control forcibly, and they rule without legal or constitutional limits, whereas autocrats have absolute power, but through legitimate means, such as a hereditary monarchy. A dictatorship might be the result of a military coup, for example. The second way to differentiate between autocracy and dictatorship commonly is the character of the rule. So dictatorships are often characterized by some of the following: suspension of elections and civil liberties, rule by decree, repression of political opponents, not abiding by the procedures of the rule of law, and the existence of a cult of personality centered on the leader. So who does that make you think of? Kim Jong-un, of course, of North Korea. If you look up what kind of government does North Korea have, usually, at least what I found, was dictatorship. And that is because of the characteristics of his governance. However, if you're going by the definition of how did he obtain that power, he inherited it from his father, who inherited it from his father, who was the guy in charge when North Korea became a country in 1948. But most people would say because of his style of governance, it's considered a dictatorship and not an autocracy. Usually dictatorships have a negative connotation and imply oppression and abuse of power. However, that wasn't always the case. So dictators also came from Italy. In ancient Rome, the Senate used to elect dictators in times of emergency. Somebody to take charge, make decisions. We don't have time for committee meetings. But it was a very short term of power. Julius Caesar, perhaps, is the best known dictator. He was a general and was elected dictator on multiple occasions. But then one of those occasions, he declared himself dictator perpetuo, meaning dictator for life. And that was not received well and resulted in his assassination 2 months later in the infamous Ides of March. Some examples of other dictators: Joseph Stalin, Idi Amin. Used correctly in the sentence would be, quote, after the military coup, the general declared himself head of state and dissolved the legislature, effectively becoming a dictator. All right. And then last but not least, number 5 is oligarchy. Oligarchy is a power structure where wealthy elite and politics merge to create a system where the ultra-rich exert undue influence over democratic institutions. In the US, there's some complications with this because campaign donations, lobbying, certainly influenced by money, but those are legal. There's limits on them, but money certainly influences politics and therefore policy creation. And then also wealthy elite in oligarchies aren't in elected positions, so they don't fall under checks and balances systems, right? But oligarchy is the wealthy influencing policy decisions to maintain wealth. Okay, an example used in a sentence correctly would be, many political analysts argue that modern Russia functions as an oligarchy, where power is concentrated in the hands of a few wealthy businessmen closely tied to the Kremlin. Okay, so I hope this has been helpful. The 5 terms, I hope you understand them better: fascism, Antifa, autocracy/autocrats, dictatorship/dictators, and oligarchy. I hope you join me next time. I have another guest speaker who's going to come talk about First Amendment freedoms. And then after that, I will get back to another definition of terms, specifically economic structures: capitalism, Marxism, socialism, communism. All right, until then, be well, and I'll see you next month.